Jack Turner stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office, gazing down at the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered. At 42, he had everything a man could want. His tech empire had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. His name opened doors that remained closed to others. His wealth could buy almost anything in this world. Almost anything. The intercom on his mahogany desk buzzed. "Mr. Turner, your car is ready. You asked to leave by 6 today." Jack glanced at his Patek Philippe watch, a birthday gift to himself that cost more than most people earned in a year. 6:15. He was late again. "Tell Marcus I'll be down in 5 minutes. As he gathered his things, his phone lit up with a text from Mrs. Henderson, the head housekeeper at his estate. Sophie had another difficult day. She refused to eat lunch and spent most of the afternoon in her room. Jack's jaw tightened. The familiar weight of helplessness settled over his shoulders like a lead blanket. He typed back a quick response, "I'll be home soon," knowing even as he sent it that his presence would likely make little difference. The drive to his Bel Air mansion took 40 minutes through Los Angeles traffic. Marcus, his driver for the past 8 years, knew better than to make conversation when Jack stared out the window with that particular expression on his face. The expression of a man who had conquered the business world but was losing a battle much closer to home. The iron gates of the Turner estate swung open as the black Mercedes approached. The driveway curved through meticulously landscaped grounds, gardens that cost thousands of dollars monthly to maintain, gardens his daughter had never seen. The mansion itself was a modern masterpiece of glass and stone, featured in architectural magazines, a symbol of success that felt more like a mausoleum with each passing day. Jack entered through the front door, his footsteps echoing on the Italian marble floors. The house was too quiet, as it always was, too big, too empty despite the 5 staff members who worked there daily. Mrs. Henderson appeared from the dining room, her face set in the professionally sympathetic expression he had come to dread. "Good evening, Mr. Turner," she said softly. "Dinner will be ready in 30 minutes. Sophie is in the library. How was she today?" "Really?" Jack asked, setting down his briefcase. Mrs. Henderson hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "She's struggling, sir, more withdrawn than usual. She asked for her mother again this morning." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Caroline had been gone for 3 years now, a car accident that had stolen his wife and left him alone to raise a daughter he didn't know how to reach. Sophie had been only 5 when it happened. Now, at 8 years old, she was slipping further away from him, retreating into a world he couldn't access. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," Jack said quietly. "I'll go see her." He found Sophie exactly where the housekeeper had said she would be, sitting in the leather chair by the window in the library, a window that offered a spectacular view of the city lights below, a view his daughter would never see. She was small for her age, delicate, with her mother's dark hair and porcelain skin. Her eyes, a striking blue that people often commented on, stared straight ahead, unseeing. "Hello, sweetheart," Jack said from the doorway, keeping his voice gentle. Sophie's head turned slightly toward his voice, but she didn't smile. "Hi, Daddy." The formality in her tone broke his heart. She called him Daddy, but there was a distance in it, a politeness that belonged between strangers, not between a father and daughter. Jack crossed the room and sat in the chair beside her. "What are you doing?" "Listening," Sophie said simply. "The birds are singing outside. There are 3 of them, I think. Maybe 4. Jack listened and heard nothing but the faint hum of the air conditioning. His daughter lived in a world of sounds and textures he couldn't begin to comprehend. "That's wonderful that you can tell," he said, struggling for something meaningful to say. "Mrs. Henderson says you're hiring a new maid," Sophie said, changing the subject abruptly. "Yes," Jack confirmed. "Someone to help around the house and, well, someone who can spend time with you during the day. Help with your activities." "I don't need another babysitter," Sophie said, and for the first time there was emotion in her voice, frustration, maybe even anger. "I have Mrs. Henderson and Maria and Thomas and everyone else watching me all the time. I'm not a baby." "I know you're not, sweetheart. But I'm blind," Sophie cuts him off. "So I need someone to watch me every second," Sophie finished, her voice flat again. "I know." Jack felt the familiar surge of inadequacy wash over him. Every conversation seemed to end this way, with him fumbling, saying the wrong thing, building the wall between them higher instead of tearing it down. He had built $1 billion company from nothing, but he couldn't connect with his own daughter. "That's not what I meant," he said weakly. Sophie didn't respond. She turned her face back toward the window, toward the view she couldn't see, effectively dismissing him. Jack sat there for another moment, desperate to find the right words, but they wouldn't come. They never did. Finally he stood. "Dinner will be ready soon." "Will you come down?" "Maybe," Sophie said, which they both knew meant no. Jack left the library feeling like he had failed, yet another test he didn't know how to study for. Back in his own study, he poured himself a scotch, 18-year-old Macallan that cost $500 a bottle, and slumped into his desk chair. The file Mrs. Henderson had left for him sat on his desk. Information about the new hire. Clara Bennett, 28 years old, impeccable references from families in Boston and New York. There was something in her cover letter that had caught Mrs. Henderson's attention, something that made her recommend Clara above the other candidates. Jack opened the file and found the letter, reading it again. "I understand that Sophie requires someone who can see beyond her disability to the remarkable child she is. I believe every child deserves to experience the world fully, regardless of the challenges they face. I would be honored to help Sophie discover her own unique way of engaging with life." At the time, Jack had approved the hiring without much thought. Now, reading the words again, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, maybe, or perhaps just desperation dressed up as hope. Clara Bennett was scheduled to start on Monday, 3 days away. Jack took a long sip of his scotch and looked around his study, walls lined with awards and photos of business achievements, degrees from Harvard, commendations from tech industry leaders, evidence of every success he had ever had, every goal he had conquered. But none of it meant anything compared to the little girl sitting alone in the library, trapped in a darkness he couldn't lift and an isolation he'd helped create. He had built an empire, but he was losing his daughter. The worst part was, Jack didn't know how to fix it. He could throw money at the problem, and he had, hiring the best specialists, buying every assistive device available, creating a perfectly safe environment where Sophie would never be hurt. But safety wasn't what she needed. She needed a father who understood her, who could bridge the gap between her world and his. Jack finished his scotch and set the glass down with a heavy thud. Monday couldn't come soon enough. Maybe this Clara Bennett would be different. Maybe she would succeed where he and everyone else had failed. Or maybe she'd be just another well-meaning person who would eventually give up, unable to crack the shell Sophie had built around herself. Either way, Jack knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something had to change. This cold, quiet mansion filled with expensive things and empty spaces wasn't a home. It was a prison, one where both he and Sophie were serving a sentence neither of them deserved. The question was whether Clara Bennett held the key to their freedom, or if they were both destined to remain locked in their separate cells, forever unable to reach each other across the divide. Clara Bennett arrived on a Monday morning in early October, carrying a single worn leather satchel and wearing a smile that seemed to light up the cavernous entrance hall of the Turner mansion. She was younger than Jack had expected from her resume, 28. There was something understated about her, a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but somehow commanded it anyway. "Mr. Turner," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for this opportunity." Jack shook her hand, noting the firmness of her grip. "Mrs. Henderson will show you around and introduce you to Sophie. I have to leave for the office, but I'll be back this evening." "Of course," Clara said. "I look forward to meeting her." Jack left for work that morning with the same gnawing anxiety he always felt when leaving Sophie with someone new. By lunchtime, he had already checked his phone twice for messages from Mrs. Henderson reporting problems. There were none. When he arrived home that evening, the house felt different. He couldn't put his finger on what had changed, but something in the atmosphere had shifted. The oppressive silence that usually greeted him was broken by a sound he hadn't heard in months: laughter. Sophie's laughter, bright and genuine, echoing from somewhere upstairs. Jack stood frozen in the foyer, his briefcase still in hand, listening to that beautiful sound like a man hearing music for the first time. Mrs. Henderson appeared from the kitchen. and even her usually stern face had softened. "They've been like that most of the afternoon," she said quietly. "Miss Clara has a way with her." Jack climbed the stairs, slowly following the sound of his daughter's joy. He found them in Sophie's bedroom, Sophie sitting on the floor with Clara beside her, some kind of textured fabric spread out between them. "Now feel this part," Clara was saying, guiding Sophie's small hands across the material. "Can you tell the difference? This one is smooth like water, and this one is rough like tree bark." Sophie's fingers moved carefully across the fabrics, her face completely absorbed in concentration. "This one feels like the garden stones by the fountain, and this one is soft like my blanket." "Exactly," Clara said, her voice full of genuine delight. "You're creating a map in your mind, Sophie. Every texture tells you something about the world." Jack cleared his throat from the doorway. Both of them turned toward him, Clara with a welcoming smile, Sophie with an expression that wasn't quite happy but wasn't closed off either. "Daddy," Sophie said, "Clara is teaching me about textures. Did you know that everything in the whole world has its own feeling?" I didn't think about it that way," Jack admitted, stepping into the room. He met Clara's eyes over Sophie's head. "How was your first day?" "Wonderful," Clara said simply. "Sophie is an incredible student." Over the following days, Jack began to notice changes in his daughter that seemed impossible. Small things at first: Sophie coming down to breakfast without being called, Sophie asking questions about the house and the garden, Sophie smiling more. But then the changes became more dramatic, more unsettling in their inexplicability. A week after Clara's arrival, Jack came home to find Sophie walking through the garden without assistance. Not the hesitant, shuffling steps she usually took when guided by Mrs. Henderson's arm, but confident strides, her head held high, moving around the fountain and between the rose bushes, as if she could see exactly where she was going. Jack watched from the terrace, his heart pounding. Clara walked several paces behind Sophie, her hands relaxed at her sides, not hovering protectively as everyone else always did. "Sophie, be careful." Jack started to call out, but Clara raised a gentle hand to stop him. "Watch," she said softly. Sophie walked through the entire garden path without a single misstep, her small hands occasionally reaching out to brush against a hedge or feel the edge of the fountain, but moving with a sureness that defied explanation. When she reached the bench at the far end of the garden, she sat down with perfect precision, a triumphant smile on her face. "How?" Jack breathed. "How is she doing that?" Clara turned to him, and there was something in her expression he couldn't read, not quite mysterious, but not entirely transparent either. "She's learning to trust her other senses. The sound of the fountain tells her where it is. The warmth of the sun tells her which direction she's facing. The feel of the gravel under her feet tells her when she's on the path." "In 1 week?" Jack's voice was sharp with disbelief. "The specialist said it would take years of training. Maybe Sophie didn't need specialists," Clara said gently. "Maybe she just needed someone to believe she could do it." The words stung because they were true. Jack had always seen Sophie's blindness as a limitation, a problem to be managed. He had never considered that his daughter might have capabilities he had never imagined. But his wonder was tinged with something else: suspicion. How was Clara achieving in days what trained professionals had failed to do in years? 2 weeks after Clara's arrival, Jack witnessed something that made his blood run cold with shock. He had come home early from a meeting, entering the house quietly through the side door. He could hear voices from the library and moved toward them, intending to check on Sophie. But he stopped in the doorway, frozen by what he saw. Sophie was sitting at the large oak table, a book open in front of her. Not a braille book, a regular book, with standard printed text. Her small fingers moved across the pages, not reading braille dots but tracing the shapes of the actual letters. And she was reading aloud. "The cat sat on the—" Sophie's voice was halting but clear. "Beautiful," Clara encouraged. "You're feeling the shapes of the words. Each letter has its own form, its own personality. The C curves like a smile, the T stands tall like a tree." "Mat," Sophie finished triumphantly. The cat sat on the mat. Jack must have made some sound because both of them turned toward him. Clara's expression was calm, but there was a wariness in her eyes, as if she had been caught, doing something forbidden. "Daddy," Sophie said, excited. "I'm reading." Clara showed me how to feel the words. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Jack managed, but his eyes were locked on Clara. Clara, could I speak with you for a moment, in the hallway? Clara stood smoothly, touching Sophie's shoulder. Keep practicing, Sophie. Feel each letter like we talked about. In the hallway, Jack kept his voice low, but couldn't hide the edge of alarm. What exactly are you teaching her? That's not Braille. She can't possibly be reading standard text by touch. Can't she? Clara met his gaze steadily. The letters are raised on the page, even if just slightly. The ink creates texture. Sophie's fingertips are incredibly sensitive, more sensitive than yours or mine because she's developed them that way. She's not reading the way you read. She's experiencing the words through touch. That's impossible, Jack said flatly. Is it? Clara tilted her head slightly. Or is it just something you've never seen before? Mr. Turner, Sophie has been limited by everyone's expectations of what a blind child can and cannot do. I'm simply helping her discover that those limits aren't as fixed as people think. Jack ran a hand through his hair, frustration building in his chest. Who are you? Your references were impeccable, but this isn't normal teaching. How are you doing this? For a moment, something flickered in Clara's eyes, something almost sad. I'm doing exactly what you hired me to do. I'm helping your daughter engage with the world. Does it matter how, as long as she's happy, as long as she's thriving? Yes, it matters, Jack said, his voice harder than he intended. She's my daughter. I need to understand. Do you? Clara interrupted gently. Or do you need to control? There's a difference, Mr. Turner. The words hit like a slap. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but Clara had already turned back toward the library, back to Sophie. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He lay in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. Sophie was changing, blooming in ways he had never imagined possible. She was happy, confident, engaged with life in a way she had never been before. Wasn't that what he had always wanted? But the how gnawed at him. Clara's methods defied everything he understood about blindness, about limitation, about reality itself. She'd been in their home for only 2 weeks, and already Sophie was doing things that seemed impossible. Jack pulled out his laptop and began searching. He looked up Clara's previous employers, finding glowing references but nothing unusual. He searched for unconventional teaching methods for blind children, finding articles about enhanced sensory perception but nothing that explained what he was witnessing. At 2 a.m., frustrated and exhausted, he closed his laptop. Tomorrow, he decided, he would watch Clara more closely. He would figure out what she was really doing, how she was really helping Sophie. Because deep down, beneath the gratitude and the wonder, a darker question had taken root in Jack's mind. What if Clara wasn't what she seemed? What if there was something more going on here, something he couldn't see? The irony wasn't lost on him, a sighted man, unable to see the truth, while his blind daughter seemed to be discovering an entirely new way of perceiving the world. Clara Bennett stood at the heart of it all, always smiling softly and using methods Jack didn't fully understand. She had a way of revealing things Jack hadn't even considered before. The question was, what other secrets might she uncover? And what would Jack discover when he finally understood her better? 3 weeks had passed since Clara's arrival, and Jack Turner had become a man obsessed. He found himself leaving work early, making excuses to be home during the day, watching Clara and Sophie through doorways and around corners like a spy in his own house. What he saw both amazed and unsettled him. Sophie was no longer the withdrawn, fragile child who had spent her days locked in silent isolation. She moved through the mansion with increasing confidence, her hands trailing along walls not for guidance but for connection, as if she were greeting old friends. She laughed frequently, asked endless questions, and most remarkably, seemed to perceive things that should have been impossible for someone without sight. "The roses are blooming," Sophie had announced at breakfast that morning, though the garden was 50 feet from the dining room, and the windows were closed. Mrs. Henderson had glanced at Jack with raised eyebrows, but Clara had simply smiled. "Very good, Sophie. What else do you notice?" "It's going to rain this afternoon," Sophie had said confidently. "I can feel it in the air." And she'd been right. At 3 o'clock, dark clouds had rolled in and rain had begun to fall. Jack told himself there were logical explanations. Barometric pressure changes, enhanced sense of smell, lucky guesses. But the rational part of his mind was losing the battle against a growing certainty that something extraordinary was happening under his roof. On a Thursday evening, Jack made his decision. He told Marcus he wouldn't need the car, claiming he had work to catch up on at home. But as the grandfather clock in the foyer struck 7, he watched from his study window as Clara walked down the long driveway toward the gate, carrying her worn leather satchel. She always left at 7, always walked, despite Jack's offers to have Marcus drive her to the guest house he had offered her on the property. She had politely declined, saying she preferred a small apartment in town, that she valued her privacy. Privacy. The word echoed in Jack's mind as he grabbed his keys and slipped out the side door, following at a distance. Clara walked with purpose through the quiet streets of Bel Air, her pace steady and unhurried. Jack followed in his car, keeping well back, feeling ridiculous and desperate in equal measure. What was he doing? Stalking his daughter's caretaker like some paranoid madman? But he couldn't stop. He had to know. Clara turned onto a side street, then another, leading away from the wealthy estates and toward a more modest neighborhood. Finally, she stopped in front of a small community center, a simple brick building with a hand-painted sign that read, Harmony House, a center for children with special needs. Jack parked down the street and watched as Clara entered through the front door. He sat in his Mercedes for a full 5 minutes, debating with himself, before finally getting out and approaching the building. Through the window, he could see a large room filled with children, some in wheelchairs, some with visible disabilities, others whose challenges weren't immediately apparent. And in the center of them all was Clara, kneeling on the floor, surrounded by kids who reached for her with eager hands and bright smiles. Jack pushed open the door quietly and stepped inside. The receptionist, an elderly woman with kind eyes, looked up from her desk. "Can I help you? I'm looking for Clara Bennett," Jack said, his eyes still on the scene in the main room. "Oh, you know Clara?" The woman's face lit up. "She's wonderful, isn't she? Been volunteering here for 3 years now. The children adore her." "What exactly does she do here?" Jack asked. "She works with our sensory development program," the woman explained. "She helps children learn to engage with the world in different ways. She has a real gift for it, seems to understand instinctively how each child experiences things. She's helped kids we thought would never progress. It's almost like—" She paused, searching for words. "Like she can see the world the way they do." Jack's throat tightened. Through the window in the door, he watched Clara working with a small boy who appeared to be deaf and blind. She had his hands pressed against a large drum, and as she beat out a rhythm, the boy's face transformed with joy, his whole body moving to vibrations Jack couldn't even imagine. "How long has she been doing this kind of work?" Jack asked quietly. "Oh, years and years, from what I understand. She came to us from a center in Boston, and before that New York. Always moving around, always finding children who need her most." The receptionist smiled. "She told me once that she feels called to it, that every child deserves to experience the fullness of life, regardless of their limitations." The words from Clara's application letter echoed in Jack's mind. He thanked the receptionist and slipped out before Clara could see him. But he didn't go home. Instead, he sat in his car in the parking lot, watching through the windows as Clara worked with child after child, each interaction filled with patience, understanding, and something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if Clara could truly perceive the unique way each child experienced the world. An hour passed, then another. Finally the session ended and families began collecting their children. Jack watched parents hug Clara, saw tears in some of their eyes as they thanked her. He saw the transformation in the children who had worked with her, confidence where there had been fear, joy where there had been frustration. When Clara finally emerged from the building, Jack was standing beside his car, no longer hiding. She stopped when she saw him, her expression unreadable in the dim streetlight. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "How long have you been here?" Clara finally asked, her voice neutral. "Long enough," Jack said. "I followed you. I needed to understand what you're doing with Sophie, how you're helping her." Clara walked closer, stopping a few feet away. And what do you think you've discovered? I don't know, Jack admitted, frustration bleeding into his voice. I've watched you for weeks. I've seen Sophie do things that should be impossible. I've seen you work with her in ways that make no sense according to everything I've been told about blindness. And now I find out you've been doing this for years, with dozens of children. So I'm asking you directly, Clara, what are you? Some kind of miracle worker? Is this some technique the medical community doesn't know about? Clara's expression softened. I'm not a miracle worker, Mr. Turner. I'm just someone who understands that human beings are capable of far more than we give them credit for. That's not an answer, Jack said sharply. Sophie is reading standard text with her fingers. She's navigating spaces she's never been in before. She told me this morning what color dress Mrs. Henderson was wearing. And she was right. How is that possible? How do you know it isn't? Clara countered gently. Mr. Turner, you've spent Sophie's entire life being told what she can't do. What if everyone was wrong? What if blindness doesn't mean what you think it means? You're speaking in riddles, Jack said, his voice rising. I need real answers. I need to know what's happening to my daughter. What's happening is that she's waking up, Clara said, and there was a fierce passion in her voice now. She's discovering that she can experience the world in ways you can't even imagine. Her fingertips can detect temperature variations so subtle she can tell what color something is by how it absorbs heat. She can hear spatial dimensions in the way sound bounces off surfaces. She can feel the electromagnetic fields that surround all living things. These aren't miracles, Jack. They're capabilities that every blind person has the potential to develop, if someone believes in them enough to help them unlock it. Jack stared at her, his mind reeling. That's not scientifically possible, isn't it? Clara stepped closer. There are documented cases of blind people who can echolocate like dolphins, who can sense objects through changes in air pressure, who can distinguish colors through touch. The human brain is infinitely adaptable, especially a child's brain. Sophie isn't doing anything supernatural. She's just learning to use the 90% of her sensory perception that sighted people ignore. Then why isn't everyone teaching this? Why aren't the specialists? Because it requires something most people don't have, Clara interrupted. It requires absolute belief that it's possible. It requires someone who can guide a child into a way of perceiving that they themselves can never fully understand. It requires... She paused, and for the first time, Jack saw vulnerability in her eyes. It requires someone who's willing to step into darkness and trust that there's another kind of light waiting there. Jack's hands were shaking. He clenched them into fists. I don't understand. If you can do this, if this is real, why are you just a maid in my house? Why aren't you working with institutions, getting this recognized? A sad smile crossed Clara's face. Because institutions want proof, documentation, peer-reviewed studies. They want it to fit into their existing understanding of the world. But this work, it's not about data and statistics. It's about individual children and individual breakthroughs. It's about Sophie learning to trust herself more than she trusts everyone else's limitations. But who are you really? Jack asked, his voice almost pleading. Where did you learn this? Clara looked away toward the community center. I had a sister, she said quietly. She was born deaf and blind. Everyone said she'd never communicate, never connect with the world. But I was 8 years old, and I refused to believe that. I spent hours with her every day, trying everything I could think of. And slowly, she began to respond. She began to develop ways of perceiving that amazed every specialist who met her. What happened to her? Jack asked softly. She died when she was 12, heart condition they couldn't fix. Clara's voice was steady, but Jack could hear the old grief beneath it. But before she died, she taught me something. She taught me that the world is so much bigger and stranger, and more wonderful than what we can see with our eyes. And I promised her I would help other children discover what she discovered, that disability is just another way of experiencing an extraordinary world. Jack felt something crack open in his chest. This wasn't about techniques or methods or scientific explanations. This was about love, about belief, about one person's refusal to accept that limitation was permanent. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm sorry for doubting you, for following you, for being a father who wants to protect his daughter. Clara smiled. "Don't apologize for that. But Mr. Turner, you need to understand something. I can help Sophie develop these abilities, but she'll never reach her full potential if you're standing in her way." "I'm not." Jack started to protest, but Clara held up a hand. "You are. Every time you doubt what she can do, she feels it. Every time you see her blindness as a tragedy instead of just a different way of being, she internalizes that. Your daughter is capable of experiencing the world in ways that would astound you, but only if you let her, only if you trust her and trust me." Jack looked at this young woman who had walked into his home 3 weeks ago and turned his entire world upside down. She wasn't a miracle worker. She was something more human than that, someone who had taken her own pain and transformed it into purpose. "I want to trust you," he said finally. "I want to believe this is real. But Clara, she's all I have left. If something goes wrong, then I'll be there," Clara said firmly. "But you need to decide. Are you going to keep Sophie in a cage made of your fear, or are you going to let her fly?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with consequence. And Jack Turner, the billionaire who had always had all the answers, realized he was standing at a crossroads with no map to guide him. All he had was a choice: fear or faith. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Jack had spent 8 years building walls around his heart, constructing elaborate defenses against the pain of not being able to fix his daughter. Tearing those walls down took time, patience, and a willingness to be vulnerable in ways that terrified him. But Clara was there every step of the way, teaching him not just about Sophie, but about himself. It started with small exercises. Clara would sit with Jack in the library after Sophie had gone to bed, and she would make him close his eyes. "Tell me what you hear," she would say. At first, Jack heard nothing but silence, but Clara was patient, and gradually his ears began to open to a symphony he had never noticed before. The hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen, the settling of the house as temperatures shifted, the rustle of leaves against the window, the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the foyer, each sound traveling through the mansion like a pulse. "Now tell me what you feel," Clara would instruct. The texture of the leather chair beneath his hands, the temperature differential between the air near the window and the air near the fireplace, the weight of his own breathing, the subtle vibration of his heartbeat. "This is Sophie's world," Clara explained. "Rich, complex, full of information that sighted people train themselves to ignore. When you start to experience even a fraction of what she experiences, you begin to understand that she's not missing anything. She's accessing everything differently." The real breakthrough came 3 weeks after their confrontation. Jack had come home early, drawn by an inexplicable urge to see his daughter. He found Clara and Sophie in the music room, a space that had sat largely unused since Caroline's death. His wife had been a pianist, and the grand Steinway still sat in the corner, covered with a dust cloth that Mrs. Henderson changed weekly but never removed. Clara had removed it. Sophie sat on the piano bench, her small hands resting on the keys, her face tilted upward, as if listening to something only she could hear. Clara stood behind her, not touching, just present. "Feel the keys under your fingers," Clara was saying softly. "Each one has a different voice. They're all waiting to sing for you." Sophie pressed a key tentatively. A single note rang out, clear and pure. She smiled. "That's a C," Clara said. "It sounds like sunshine, doesn't it? Warm and bright." Sophie pressed another key, lower, deeper. "This one sounds like Daddy," she said. Strong and serious. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He started to step forward, but Clara's eyes met his across the room, and she gave a tiny shake of her head. "Wait," her expression said. "Watch." So Jack stood in the doorway and watched as his daughter discovered music. Sophie's fingers began to move across the keys, creating not a melody, but a soundscape, high notes and low notes, gentle touches and firm presses, her face reflecting wonder and concentration. It wasn't a song that any composer would recognize, but it was beautiful in its raw, unfiltered expression. "My mommy used to play this piano," Sophie said suddenly, her hands stilling on the keys. "I know," Clara said gently. "Can you feel her in it?" Sophie's fingers traced the smooth surface of the keys reverently. "Yes, it feels warm, like she's still here." Jack felt tears burning in his eyes. Caroline had played for Sophie when she was a baby. She had held their daughter on her lap and let her feel the vibrations of the music. It was one of the few memories Jack had allowed himself to keep, one of the few connections between mother and daughter that death hadn't stolen. Sophie began to play again, and this time, there was something almost intentional in the sound she created. Not a melody, but a pattern, rising and falling like a conversation, like a heartbeat, like waves on a shore. "That's beautiful, Sophie," Clara said. "What does it sound like to you?" "It sounds like remembering," Sophie answered. "Like missing someone but being happy they were here." Jack couldn't hold back anymore. He walked into the room, and both Clara and Sophie turned toward the sound of his footsteps. Different footsteps than they were used to, softer, more hesitant, carrying the weight of emotion. "Daddy?" Sophie's hands lifted from the keys. "Are you crying?" He had learned from Clara that honesty was more important than maintaining a facade of strength. "Happy tears, sweetheart. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Sophie's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire being. "Really, you're not just saying that?" "Really," Jack confirmed. He crossed to the piano and knelt beside the bench, bringing himself to her eye level. "Sophie, I need to tell you something. I need to tell you that I'm sorry." "Sorry for what?" Sophie's unseeing eyes turned toward him with that uncanny accuracy that still amazed him. "For not understanding," Jack said. "For thinking that your blindness was something that needed to be fixed. For building walls around you instead of helping you explore the world. For being so afraid of losing you that I almost lost you anyway." Sophie's small hand reached out and found his face, her fingers tracing the contours of his cheeks, his nose, his forehead, reading him the way she'd learned to read everything else. "You're not lost, Daddy," she said seriously. "You're right here." Jack smiled through his tears and pulled her into his arms, holding her the way he should have been holding her all along, not like a fragile object that might break, but like a strong, capable person who could weather the world's storms. "I love you, Sophie," he whispered into her hair. "I love you exactly as you are." "I know," Sophie said simply. "I could always feel it, but now I can hear it too." Over Sophie's head, Jack's eyes met Clara's. She was smiling, tears streaming down her own face, and in that moment, Jack understood that she had been leading him toward this all along, not just toward accepting Sophie's blindness, but toward accepting his own humanity, his own limitations, his own need to trust and let go. The weeks that followed were filled with discoveries. Jack cleared his schedule, delegating responsibilities he had always thought only he could handle, and spent his afternoons with Sophie and Clara. He learned to close his eyes and navigate the mansion by touch and sound. He learned to identify objects by texture alone. He learned to listen to the subtle cues in Sophie's voice that told him when she was happy, frustrated, excited, or tired. And slowly, tentatively, he learned to let go of his fear. The culminating moment came on a Saturday morning in early December, 2 months after Clara had entered their lives. Jack woke to find Sophie's bedroom empty. A spike of panic hit him. Old habits died hard, but then he heard voices from the garden. He went to the window and looked down. Sophie was standing at the edge of the garden path, dressed in a coat and scarf, her face turned toward the morning sun. Clara stood several feet away, her hands relaxed at her sides. "Are you ready?" Clara called out. "Yes," Sophie answered, and there was absolute confidence in her voice. Jack watched, his heart in his throat, as Sophie began to walk, not down the familiar garden path she'd navigated a dozen times, but toward the gate that led to the street beyond, the gate that led to the world outside the estate's walls. His first instinct was to run downstairs, to stop her, to pull her back to safety, but he forced himself to stay at the window, to trust what Clara had taught him. Sophie walked steadily, her white cane, a new addition accepted not as a symbol of disability, but as a tool for exploration, sweeping in controlled arcs ahead of her. She moved through the gate and onto the sidewalk beyond, Clara following at a distance, ready to intervene if needed, but giving Sophie space to navigate independently. Jack watched his daughter walk down the street, his blind daughter, who months ago wouldn't leave her room, and felt something shift in his chest. Not the breaking of his heart, but the expansion of it. She was free. He had let her go, and she was free. By the time they returned an hour later, Jack was waiting in the garden. Sophie's cheeks were flushed with cold and excitement, her smile radiant. "Daddy, I walked to the corner store, she announced, running toward him with sure steps. Clara let me go in by myself, and I bought a candy bar with my own money, and the lady at the counter didn't even know I was blind until I told her. Jack scooped her up, spinning her around the way he used to when she was a toddler. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart. So incredibly proud. I wasn't scared at all, Sophie said as he set her down. Well, maybe a little bit. But the scared feeling was good. It meant I was doing something real. Jack looked over at Clara, who stood at the edge of the garden, giving them their moment. Thank you, he mouthed silently. Clara smiled and nodded, but she didn't take credit. She never did. She simply stepped back and let the moment belong to father and daughter. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, after she had talked for 2 hours straight about her adventure, about the sounds of the street and the feeling of independence and all the places she wanted to explore next, Jack and Clara sat in the library. She's going to be okay, Jack said. It wasn't a question. Better than okay, Clara agreed. She's going to be extraordinary. She already is. I want to do more, Jack said suddenly. I want to fund programs like the one you run at Harmony House. I want to help other families understand what you've taught me. He paused, searching for the right words. I want Sophie's blindness to be a gift to the world, not just a challenge she overcomes. Clara looked at him with something like wonder. Jack Turner, you've come a long way from the man who hired me 2 months ago. I had a good teacher, Jack said. 2 of them, actually. He smiled. Sophie taught me just as much as you did. She has that effect on people, Clara said softly. When you stop trying to change her and start learning from her, she transforms everything. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the fire flicker in the hearth. Will you stay? Jack asked. Not just as Sophie's caretaker, but as, I don't know, as part of our family? As a partner in whatever comes next? Clara's eyes glistened. I would like that. Sophie still has so much more to learn, and honestly, so do you. Jack laughed. I'm well aware. But I'm ready now. Ready to learn. Ready to grow. Ready to be the father she deserves. You already are, Clara said. You just needed to believe it. Upstairs, in her bedroom, Sophie lay in bed with her window cracked open, listening to the night sounds of the city she had explored today. The distant traffic, the rustle of wind through trees, the bark of a dog 3 houses away. Each sound was a story, a connection, a thread in the vast tapestry of the world. She smiled in the darkness, a darkness that had never frightened her, because she had learned it wasn't darkness at all. It was simply another way of seeing, and tomorrow she will see even more. If this video helped you out today, hit that like button. It really supports the channel. And if you're new here or want more tips like this, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. See you in the next one.